Well, I have the unenviable task of moderating this wrap-up session, and it's only unenviable due to the breadth and depth of the insights that were shared by our panelists. I think before we get started, I do think we coalesced around 4 big themes, which is kind of interesting. The first one being, who is migration working for? And I think we had excellent examples of both of forced migration as well as economic migration that sometimes can work for migrants and certainly for receiving communities, but all too often fail to serve the real needs and desires of people who are on the move. We also really troubled this idea of our classification system. What is a refugee? What is an economic migrant? How do these categories really have utility in 2017? Is the world so vastly different from the 1950s when many of these classification schemas were developed that we really need to rethink what we mean by terms like IDP or refugee or asylum seeker or economic migrant? Educational migrant, tide migrants is an issue that we didn't really talk about, but that too comes into play greatly. And thirdly, we had a really amazing opportunity to look at changes in migration trends over time and across space. So certainly up until 1950, we see a certain type of refugee flow that is oftentimes at the end of a war. Some wars used to end. For you, the youngsters in the crowd, you might not be aware of that. But the idea that you had clear combatants, there was an end to hostility, and then you had a refugee flow. We have a very different situation now. And to what extent can these earlier studies really inform and provide us amazing background that we can utilize in developing better policies and analytical tools to look at the very different types of refugee flows that we have right now. More importantly, place. We traveled from the Middle East to Africa, through Eastern Europe, and back to Indiana. So it was really quite a trip this morning, and I think that we can see that migration and migration concerns really do vary by place. And most importantly was the insight from our legal perspective that place matters. That place, even though it is a construct with real implications. And we can't really give up on the way in which people have affinities to specific places, but also how people mythologize other places and think about destination choice and migration goals. So I'd like to thank our panelists as well as our audience for joining us this morning. And at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions, either from our audience or hand over the talking stick, so to speak, to any of our panelists if they have anything else to add.
So going back to the topic of sustainability, thinking long term, I would like to hear from you about the durable solutions put forth by the UN. What could be alternatives to those solutions, or how could we better implement them? Thinking about voluntary repatriation, which is not always voluntary. Also, what does it mean? Do people actually go back to their hometown? Do they go from being refugees to internally displaced people? Thinking about reintegration in the second host country. Sometimes those host countries are not necessarily willing, or at least, it doesn't seem like they're willing to actually keep those people. And thinking of the Palestinians, sometimes the refugees don't actually want to be reintegrated. And then thinking about resettlement, only 1% of the refugee population gets resettled. So it seems like those durable solutions have only led to protracted displacement. And so thinking about sustainability, long-term, what are alternatives? $1 million question.
I think it might be worth slightly more.
Even more.
Yes.
Those are really important questions. I think I'm thinking more on some of the things that Cynthia said, but I think one thing is not to put people in camps. I would start there. That I think camps are a way of controlling people, and I think they don't lead to self-reliance, and they don't lead to people being able to move on. And every place I've seen camps, they're awful, and they become more prison-like. And I think the future for refugees and migrants is urban life. And we have to find strategies where people can work in urban settings, because that's more where work is going to be, and not camps, and not think with camp mentalities. Maybe I'll just stop right there, but not camps. No one wants to be in a camp.
And the durable solutions by the UN, this comes back to the sentence of the state and the nation-state model. Because each of the three durable solutions bases, if you actually look at what the UN says the durable solutions are there for, it is to solve the protracted displacement of refugees. So that's their aim, and this is really, the terminology is really important here. So each of the three, repatriation, local integration, and local integration under that framework is a model where refugees are allowed to eventually get citizenship. So this is not a permanent residency. So this isn't just what Uganda is doing, like this is actually like recognizing these refugees are here for a long time, we're going to allow them to become part of our society, and resettlement. So each of those three solutions is based on the premise that displacement can be resolved by reinserting a refugee back into a system of national protection. I don't think that that is actually what displacement is about, necessarily. Displacement is something that goes beyond just having access to rights that are grounded in nationalism. And if you go back and look at some of the anthropological work on nations and refugees, like Lisa Malky's work on the geographical uprooting of people, it's actually those categories that are themselves the problem. We have no way of thinking about people outside of the nation-state category system. So that's why refugees continue to be vulnerable, continue to be people who are not protected, because we don't have a way of thinking outside of the nation-state. So it's it remains to be a really salient idea. So I spend a lot of time gasbagging about how the durable solutions don't really resolve displacement, but what are the alternatives in a world where the nation-state system continues to be the dominant way of organising people? And I think, you can have as many experts as you want waxing lyrical on that, but we need to actually look at what refugees themselves not only think, but what they're doing. So Uganda was interesting in the sense that they didn't put this model in because they were trying to be progressive. They weren't trying to get in the good books. They were just like, crap, we've already got this situation happening. What can we do to recognise what refugees are already doing? So we already know that many refugees, when given the choice, will go to cities, because that is seen as a place where they can create a livelihood. Refugees want to get education a lot of the time. The things that stop them are the fact that the rights system doesn't recognise that. Well, and you actually made this point before, that sometimes the rights system can recognise that, it's just not implemented that way. So there's a lot about that. I think it's Alexander Betts who makes an argument that if we actually implemented what's in the convention, if we implemented the rights that refugees are supposed to have, they're supposed to have freedom of movement, they're supposed to have rights to work, we would actually see a much better system of asylum. But yeah, so there's a lot about nation states and the way in which the UN creates these ideas about solutions, and we can only ever think in terms of that. So I'm not sure what the solution is, but certainly going to refugees and seeing what they want to do and what they do would be a good start to this question.
If I may add a little bit on that, I believe it has always to be a comprehensive, not just one way or another. We can all do together. And first of all, United Nations. Sometimes I like to term this as the Security Council mess up, and the humanitarian agencies clean up the mess. Which is to say that Security Council has to be empowered in a way that it's functional and it's effective, it's working, it's addressing the root causes of the conflict. So we usually say pepper tiger. United Nations is a big organization, but it does not have a very effective way of doing things. So probably this is something international stakeholders community, especially the United States, can be leading the way. Hopefully. And the second also is from the part of the political will of nation-state actors. Whenever something happens, crisis in the Middle East or Southeast Asia, Rohingya, both people, how willing we are to work together collaboratively to address this issue. That's the big questions. And then finally, I like to think as more of a visionary, long-term. The diaspora community can also play a very important role in not only addressing the issues in their own respective communities, but also back home. And I always tell our community members, you are the ones that will actually redo Burma in 20 years, 30 years. We have seen that in many countries, Singapore, Thailand, and even some EU countries. So I think, looking at that, it is the best interest of international community for the case of the United States, it's the best interest that we work together to the long run so that they are going back and address that issue, the root causes, and also the balance is that they usually bring the values of this country where they have tried, or they have influence, many years, democracy, some other set of values. So I think if there are a lot of many things that we can do, but I think those are the things that I think we probably can do as a community to issue.
So the question has to do with durable solutions, and I was thinking, generally speaking, I do think it's this question in all parties are openly wrapped up with the existence of the state system. And in a sense, I think this is one of the places that shows the tragic nature of, or even the tragic insolubility of so many of these problems, because the idea of durable solutions in many respects makes us look away from the political context of these crises. Now, often war, that's our paradigm, but it could be poverty or repression or something else. But it's especially clear in the case of violent conflicts that have displaced large numbers of people. Going back obviously implies solving that problem in some way that people can have a stable life. But the idea of integration, as you pointed out, leading to citizenship, I think one of the problems with this, and to my mind it shows kind of the schizophrenic desires of the debate around asylum and refugees, is if you succeed in that as a solution, this terminates, in practice, this terminates the claim of these people in relation to their own state or community. I mean, it doesn't have to, in theory, you can have multiple citizenships, for example, but in practice we know that that's what it does. And if you settle and become a citizen, in fact in law, in many cases you find that your other citizenship is terminated. So this is a problem if we're thinking about an individual's life circumstances and the success of integrating in a city somewhere and making a life. But that person is part of a large flow of people that is political in nature, and often politicized. You mentioned the Palestinians, so this is a great example of that, right? The non-integration of Palestinian refugees throughout that region is both because of the enabling of local states that don't want them to, but also the maintenance of a claim, right? And if those populations ever normalize their status, that claim would become weaker. And we'll in fact know when the Israeli-Palestinian crisis is finally resolved. One of the indicators of that will be sometime in the next millennia or so. Will be when the claims of refugees are formally terminated. Then we'll know. Right? And so I think this is a problem. The idea of a solution is a solution for individuals. It actually bespeaks the abandonment of the political context in which those crises arose. And frankly, many actors are unwilling to do that. Sometimes for good reason, right? Because the politics matters too. I think there is no easy answer to that, because the two things are in tension with each other.
That's why we have an impasse. That's why we have so many people in camps, because no one knows quite what to do with them. Because, I mean, a lot of people see countries like Uganda as doing a second durable solution, but legally they're not, and they can't. So it has the legal context of this is crucial, because we can't think outside the state, and yet we have people who are outside the state, whose actual, and going back to the root cause, I mean, my whole argument in my book is that this focus on solution and the temporal context of crisis actually turns us away from the root causes, which are a lot of the time based around state issues as well, or global international exploitation of different states and predation and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, we can't think outside of that model, so we have these people who are a problem, and it's no wonder that Lisa Malky wrote about this 30 years ago, and we still have the same issue. Nothing has changed. The nation is saying
Except people, there's plenty of people who do want citizenship. And there's plenty of countries that would profit from having people become new citizens. So it's not as insoluble as it seems. And I actually think there are ways, and I very much feel that the diaspora communities have so much to offer here, unlike international organizations, which I think are bloodsuckers for money. And that it's really important that the diaspora communities help themselves and help the communities that come in. They know better what their people need. And let me give you a really simple example of organizational drawing. The group that I dealt with that was forced out of the Balkans, they had people coming in on trains and nobody knew when they would come in. So they had forced migrants coming in on trains with no place to go. Now, there was no outside agency that was going to help them in Istanbul because nobody gave a hoot. And there were some people in Istanbul, they said, we have to have people there to meet them because they're just going to sit in the train station with no place to go. So they said, why don't we have one person from our group, we're going to organize so there'll be one person at the train station every day of the month. That was the beginning of the organization. Can you see how that's the beginning of an organization? So they made one person be there every day of the month to meet them, and then they rented an old leather warehouse so they had a place to put people. That's the beginning of organization. And then they found places to put people. This is how you start to take care of your own. That's much better than trying to get the UN to do something where all the money would go to Geneva or New York, and the people would still not have any place to stay. I really think there's plenty of things people can do when they know what the need is, and they're not going to spend extra money. And then they're going to know who needs need. And then the group that I dealt with basically did all their care on the basis of Islam. So people kept their dignity. So all their organization was based on Muslim holidays. So they would meet with the family, and the next day after the holiday they would meet with their organization. So people didn't feel like people were looking down on them when they gave them new clothing, because they always gave it during Ramadan. So there's so many ways that you can build on the local culture to support people. And I think that's what people need to do in urban centers with migrants. And there's so many things that can be done. But if you get outsiders trying to do stuff, you're always inefficient. You're always going against people's norms. And people do want citizenship. And I think you can eventually work through this. The Germans actually did this, believe it or not. Up till 1998, Helmut Kohl, it said, this is not an immigrant country. And Germany was taking more immigrants than any country in Europe. And then you had a coalition government and the Greens came in and they said, we are an immigrant country. And guess what? 2005, Germany found a way to give people citizenship. So if Germany can change, any country can change.
I would just, I think everyone's covered sort of the main points, but I would just add that we really need to make sure we're engaging women in decision making, especially at the local level. I think, I like the idea of the local community response, and I agree there's so much waste from international organizations, and I've seen sort of how the UN functions, and by the time the money gets to the people who need it, it really isn't very much. But women are often left out of decision making, and I think when you diversify sort of the group of people who are caring for their communities, women have new perspectives, bring diversity, and I think you can find sort of novel solutions. And I think resolving the political issues and conflicts is key, addressing the root causes is key, and I think right now if you look at Iraq and Syria, for example, the whole response has been pretty much military, with a little bit of aid thrown in to keep people alive. So that has to change. That's not going to bring about any sort of long-term change. And I think if you do really bring women into that sort of picture in a meaningful way, then you might sort of shift what's happening.
If I could just add in two things, is that increasingly now in the literature examining state capacity, there is an increasing emphasis on thinking about state capacity in terms of the capacity to address crises, right? And many of them are part and parcel with migration flows, either economic or forced. And if we really think about, rather than focusing on militarization, thinking about building capacities even in structures that don't cover everything, that what we are looking at in terms of migration, in many cases, the forced migration comes from failures of state capacity to protect borders or to protect minorities. But even in addition to that, what it really masks is the sad truth that if one wants a durable approach to regularizing migration, we need to come to some sort of consensus about what kind of international and global inequality we are willing to tolerate as an international community. That's a much longer term, much thornier issue to address. But as long as we have people who are living on $1 a day, who within one airplane flight can get to a country where they can make 100 times that, they will move. And no state, even the Gulf states, haven't been able to control migration. When people want in, they will find ways to get in. Not all of them, but some of them shall. And so when we really think about durability, we're tackling a very thorny question of inequality and what levels of inequality are we as a global community ready to embrace.
I was going to ask a question about what role do you think the private sector or business might be able to play in addressing durable solutions, both in terms of conflicts and things that causes why people move, but also what to do after engage. So, for example, we touched upon entrepreneurship, but maybe businesses, sources of employment, sources of empowerment, sources of culture change. Social entrepreneurship, for example, is very geared towards trying to empower those who feel themselves less powerful. What role do you think that might be able to play, for good or for bad?
Germany came up with a positive. Germany's a fascinating case because Germany did an about-face with immigration in the past 20 years. And when it decided Germany was an immigrant nation, and Germany has an aging population, so it needs to be an immigrant nation. And what happened really from 2005 till about 2014 is it became, unlike the rest of Europe, it became very positive, and it really helped that the German economy was very booming. But what they got is they got foundations, but they also got private companies to put out ads that they were looking for migrant labor in positive things. But they also got organizations that would help new migrants get acclimated into new jobs. So there was ways to not only hire, but also help them in the new work. And this really, I worked with a bunch of mayors. I mean, I went to 12 different cities in Germany and talked to different mayors how they got the industries in their towns to hire these new migrants. Some of them were refugees, but mostly migrants in this case. And they had people that would work with the industries to make sure that the new person hired worked out. And that makes a big difference because the industries wanted to help and they needed the labor, but they weren't exactly sure how to ensure this was going to work. And that made a big difference. But again, it was a combination of positive political will and also the local authorities working with them. I was really impressed, and it made a huge difference how the Bürgermeister, how the mayor worked.
I could give you a much more pressing example. Would be in the case of the Russian Federation, where the mayor of Nizhny Novgorod, third largest city in the country, formerly was the owner of the largest construction firm in the region, and most construction work done in Russia is done by unregistered migrant labor. Thank you very much. I hate to always be the one harping on that issue, but yes. And so in Nizhny, the problem highlights a different role for business. There, incentives were such that businesses were participating in the migration industry, hiring unregistered workers, cutting labor standards, stiffing migrants in terms of labor contracts, not following any sort of safety standards. And if you're not following the safety standards set by Gazpromstroy in Russia, you're really, I don't know what you're doing. You're juggling chainsaws. I don't know what they're doing. So even minimum safety standards aren't being met. When businesses and consumers who frequent those businesses, because the power of the pocketbook is important, when businesses take it upon themselves to realize that it's in their best interest to participate in responsible utilization of migrant labor, as Francis illustrates in Germany, then you really have a positive and really potentially profitable role for business to play in terms of the acceptance of refugees, internally displaced, or labor migrants. And unfortunately, we find in many receiving countries, United States and Russia being the two largest receiving countries, businesses have had the incentive to skirt official regulations. And the more adherence that we can have and the more enforcement we can have on that, perhaps the better the expanding role for private industry could be in addressing migrant crises.
Can I add that? I completely agree with the ones we discussed already here. And I just want to also bring our experience in that place. We want perhaps more than 30 employees. And those who directly employ potentially those in the central. And if we look back 5 or 7 years ago, it was that we were looking for employers who would be willing to employ refugees, those who do not have skills, not have language skills, or cannot communicate in English, and different cultural backgrounds. Who would want to employ those individuals? It was quite a difficult process that we come to realize after engagement, also they have seen the hardworking nature of that very strong ethics, work ethics. Now it's the opposite. The employers call us when we have business refugees. So really, I think trying to come together and see the values of employing refugees from either working very hard or maybe a diversity perspective as well. And ultimately, it's a win-win for the community. And the second point that I want to also make is just hire them is not just enough. We need to come up with a system through which, or model through which they are trained linguistic also sometimes, including requalifications and recredentials with certifications, so that they are moving up. And perhaps not only they can sustain their employment, but also they can go up like leaders, supervisors, and managers. So it requires, I think, a little bit more of, again, comprehensive planning with refugee settlement agencies, stakeholders, and employees. And the second point that I would like to make is business. Of course, I think they can always give more social giving as part of their social responsibilities. Multinational corporations, they can always donate or give through their foundations or some other means. And in fact, they are great contributors to that effort.
Very wise.
And finally, internationally, let's say for Southeast Asia or Burma or Africa or Middle East, I think now the USAID or State Department has kind of developed a model where it is a requirement for a non-profit to work with businesses. They have seen the benefits of coming together. So I think it's really collaborative opportunities that the business are increasingly seeing. And of course, we need to see more of that improvement in that process.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons why I asked this question, first of all, just because I'm interested in finding out ways that business can be a force for good in the world, but also, certain countries or regions of the world, we keep talking about the nation-state, the state system. There are parts of the world where that just does not function. I mean, it's the lip service is there, but realistically, the nation-state doesn't really function as it should or as people need it to. But there are ways that those are still countries that business is taking place, and even multinational and international business is taking place. So could business be a potential inroad for durable solutions or the foundations for durable solutions to get into these areas or these parts of the world? I guess it's kind of the second addendum to what I'm asking. Do you see that as a possibility or not really?
It is, but it's very interesting that it depends what kind of economy business has. For example, Germany has high knowledge level business, so they say only 10 to 15% of the German economy is labor-based rather than knowledge-based. And this is what, so they say, look at the cheap labor from the EU, the Poles and the Bulgars have taken most of that. So if you want labor for your new refugees, they've got to learn German really well. I mean, you have to look at what labor force they need. So this is the kind of thing you have to look at. So we don't want just muscle, we want brain power. And if they want brain power, they want good German. So these are the constraints that people are under.
But what about, for example, a German company that has a factory or a distribution center or something in one of these nation states that are functioning less than optimal? So, for example, people are still buying the necessities of life, even though there's a conflict or famine or what have you. So business is still happening. It may not be the level of business that maybe we're accustomed to here in the Western world, but transactions are taking place.
So you're trying to get them to start building up in the whole country rather than in Germany itself?
Yes, because people move for reasons, and sometimes they reasons force them to move.
The first time I pulled out my iPhone in front of a participant, she looked at it and she said, "That comes from my country."
Yeah.
And I said, "Wait," I was like, "Oh, what do you mean? It's got made in China on the back. There's Foxconn workers, right? It's not you guys." No, I mean, the minerals in iPhones are from, I think it's like 90% of them come from the DRC, like this particular chip, right? So, I mean, business is deeply, and it's kind of, my postdoc project is on political economy of forced migration, to look at this global connect, to look at the local context of resettlement and the sending countries, because, it's Australian, a lot of the companies in the DRC are Australian mining companies, so, and they don't do shit for refugees, right? For people in the local communities, and in fact it is a source of instability. it is a source of militarization over so the east of Congo is a wreck, not only because of the, as the UN likes to call it, the fragile state of the DRC, which will probably be in civil war again this year, because the Kabila hasn't left his position, he's broken the constitution as of the 12th of December. So that conflict is not going away, but it's not just about the politics, it's about the willingness of this fragile state creates the conditions under which these companies flourish. And I mean, at the moment they're talking about, in different kinds of mining require different types of labor, so you've got them sending children down mine holes to do what they call artisanal mining, because they have small hands and they can pick out the minerals that they need. So, I mean, this is what frustrates. So, business sure could play a role in not, promulgating that. And I think it's a really interesting, I mean, I'm fairly cynical about business, but as an idea, I'm fairly cynical of the state-based way of doing a durable solution too, frankly. So that could work. I just want to add on to the resettlement context, though. I'm also cynical about that because, theme, right? But I mean, refugees who are trying to make a life in a country like America or Australia, they become a very docile workforce. They're very useful. So I think you're right in the sense of, yes, it's great that these businesses can throw jobs at refugees and they're not unemployed. In America, you don't, let's be clear, in America you don't have a choice as a refugee, right? There are brokers. Like, I have actually overheard resettlement workers have conversations like, oh yeah, I just got this refugee family in, into employment. So they were taking bets on how long they could get them in to a job. And there is very little social mobility. And that's the point, right? So if you're giving refugees is not the full stop, it's about giving refugees employment that can then lead to a meaningful life, that they can have areas of social mobility, they can learn the language. There are some refugees who never learn English in this country, not because they don't want to, but because they don't have time. They're too busy working 12 hours. They don't get to see some of them don't see their children. So I know refugee families here who, because they have to have a two-person income, otherwise they won't survive. So mum goes to work at night, dad goes to work during the day, their children, they don't get to actually spend time as a family together. So what kind of life are we leading people into when we just say, oh, isn't it great that all these factory jobs are taking refugees? So they're really a population at risk of exploitation. And there's some very interesting correlations between undocumented immigration policy and refugee policy in this country. Because once it became really difficult to have undocumented migrants, particularly in factories, not so much in farm work, you see this correlation of refugees being resettled in these specific areas to take those jobs, because they are not the kind of workforce that's going to create as much of a problem for the employers. So it's not this, oh, isn't it great that these businesses are doing something for the refugee community? There's, there's a dual issue here. So unless refugees are given opportunity for social mobility, I mean, you're just exploiting them in a different place.
I was going to say, I was thinking about the question of the extractive industries, but I don't know that we need to add more cynicism.
Sorry? Come now, it's a day for it.
What I was thinking is, in a sense, the example you gave is very responsive in yet another way, quite compatible with what you're saying. To your question is the cell phone, because those minerals are in your cell phone. It's not that they could be, they are. So this is like a sense evidence that evidently business is able to operate in these stateless places, extract these minerals, produce our phones, and we don't see those kind of effects. So could business be a model? Theoretically, yes, but there's probably a good reason to think that it likely won't be, and not because business is evil, but because it's precisely the extractive industries are the one place where business can flourish without a stable state. I think businessmen would be the first to say, we would like order, stability. This is De Soto or something, a theorist, right? And we want property rules. This is true for little people and big. So in most contexts, it's really essential to have some kind of functioning state apparatus and predictable legal regime with enforcement, etc., for business to be able to do anything, let alone good things. And I think just the nature of a liberalized, globalized market is the potential for business to do good of the kind you're describing is, of course, constantly in tension with competition. So it seems a very implausible place to place our stakes, right? You need some kind of governance framework, whether it be global or a reconfigured form of states interrelating, but that's where the capacity to do good is going to appear from, I think. Or rather, I think to be consistent with Adam Smith, that's the framework within which the market can do good.
I'm not as negative. Just so you don't think everything's bad. Because I've worked with refugees from Kosovo in Detroit, in Ann Arbor, and the joy is with the kids. And watched a family, it's always only one family. The kids succeeded and went to university, and the mother's working in the county library, which is not. They tried to get her to work in a restaurant. She finally said she really didn't like food. So people listen to her. I speak Albanian, so I understood. I don't like large amounts of food either. I know good refugee stories. It wasn't business. It's just we listen to the people. Yeah. And I think with refugees, like any people, you need to listen. So this is just so you have a sense. There was 3 daughters and a son, and I think probably the daughters were. Probably the youngest daughter was probably violated in Kosovo, and the brother couldn't protect her. So he insisted on being a policeman. Now this was a professional family, and the idea that their son wanted to be a policeman was horrible to them. But he insisted on, even though he had a college degree, he insisted on becoming a policeman in America. And he's a very successful policeman in Ann Arbor, Michigan now. And so to me, this is a success story. This is a family that the children were allowed to do what they wanted, and all 4 children have university degrees. I just want to know that it's not all horror. But what it was is that people listened, and we got churches involved. I think this is where churches in America can be very positive. And so, again, things can be terrible with everybody working awful long hours, but I think Americans can be very hospitable, and you need to listen to what refugees bring. And every refugee family is different. There's not a single refugee family that fits a prototype, because there's no prototype. And then American society is various. And I remember talking their oldest daughter into the University of Michigan, and that was a huge thing, because all she had with her after she'd been a refugee from Kosovo into Macedonia, and the one thing she kept, the oldest daughter, was her admittance to the University of Vienna Architecture School. This is a proud refugee. I couldn't get her into architecture school, but I got her into graphic arts. And that's pretty darn good. And so she got, these are success stories. You have to remember the success, because there's a million failures, but there's good success too. So again, you work and you work and you work, and I think sometimes things work out. But it wasn't business, it was listening.
The working observation. Incredible, excellent analytical work and heartfelt passion for this cause. I'm wondering if way to maybe transcend this problem of the nation state construct in our minds. And it's relatively slow as we begin to talk about the idea of a universal brotherhood. That candidate Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, to bring out the moral principle. You mentioned how the churches are very effective in that, but then also saying that let's, transcending what we think of nations state elevates to a global community, a global.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think we're already seeing parts of that. I think the most effective responses to refugees have been people. And I'm not too familiar with the German case, but from my understanding, German people have seen these, Syrian refugees getting on trains and have just gone, well, I have to do something. So it's like this, I don't really know about universal morality, but there's this sort of humanity there that transcends whatever the government's telling. There are cases where people have, there was a case in Denmark, I think it was last month, where, a person saw a refugee walking on the side, they looked like a refugee, they pulled over, got them in their car, and took them to their house, gave them food, got them where they needed to go, and they actually got charged by the government because you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to help. So people are not their governments. So we're seeing a lot of responses just from people wanting to help. And I don't think that's me. I had a point with that. I mean, I'm from Australia. I'm a little more cynical because we tend to roll the other way. But yeah, I mean, certainly the state. There is a way to sort of, the state doesn't control everything. And I think we're seeing more and more that people themselves are responding to this with humanity. Yeah, I had a point, lost it. But.
No, the Germans were incredible. I mean, because Germans don't get a lot of good press. But in Munich, in Berlin, and other cities, when the refugees came by the thousands in 2015, in September, October, November, thousands, and these are Middle Easterners, and they stand out. They do not look like Northern Europeans. And they were mostly single men, and that could be frightening with all the press and all this. People came in these train stations, and they call them helpers. And they came with food. And one of the churches I was in said that we called it the 4 months of vegetable cutting. This Protestant church, St. Georg in Hamburg, cut vegetables for 4 months in cauldrons because they needed food for these people. And they call them Ehrenamtler, which is a wonderful term for volunteering. People all over Germany, just thousands, volunteered. And people slept in churches, they slept in theaters, they slept in private homes. I mean, nobody planned for this. There was no planning. And Angela Merkel said every town and village and city in Germany will take 1.5% of its population in refugees. That meant every place in Germany had refugees. Now, did they want them? No. Do the Germans have natural hospitable hearts? No. But there were almost a million people that needed to be taken in, and so they took them in. And in general German orderliness, they found ways. And I just went around looking at how they were coping, and a lot of them, they got former industrial buildings, and as they said, we painted them. We made shelters for them. We decided in one place where they had 700 people in a former industrial building, we decided, this social worker, I thought she was brilliant, she decided we had 770 refugees in this building, and we got together and decided families should have the best rooms. So in one room there were 30 men, but the families had their own rooms. So, I mean, they organized. It was just absolutely phenomenal. And then they had people giving German lessons and people giving the children, they got children in classes within 6 weeks. The children were first. And then they're giving German lessons and they're getting, into apprentice programs. So Germany really organized. Now, they've got terrible bureaucratic waiting lists because when they took them all in, they weren't able to go through and see who's who in the zoo. I mean, there wasn't real screening. So now it's a real slow process because you do need to screen. And some people are going to be sent back to Afghanistan because they don't meet asylum criteria. But it's still a remarkable achievement.
I think like international, like the UN and these international organizations are based on that kind of idea that you're getting at, like, humanitarianism that transcends, state protocol and whatever. But what we see when you bureaucratize humanity or, humanitarian sentiment, you then create all these other problems of categorizations and things like that. So yeah, the most responsive sort of situations have been just local responses. So in Uganda, there are situations where the locals themselves have just taken in refugees, like these churches. So
that's happening here.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, I mean, but what I also see is like you also have the groups of people who go the opposite way. But until we start acknowledging the sort of, and it's kind of like a public health or like a civil society sort of thing, but we need to start recognizing that there are solutions at a local scale. So the UN works at an international scale with durable solutions that have to think about nations, but if people want to help and people want to respond at a local scale, at what point can we give some recognition to that? So there's a lot of political control over these situations that could, potentially be deconstructed a little bit more. But that's kind of in a, it could be. There is an otherwise that is actually, that recognizes the good. But
I think we can look at what the UN does and do precisely the opposite. The UN takes an incredible amount of time and usually doesn't listen. And usually gets people who are not of the culture, not women. And it's just amazing. The people who are the most effective are the ones who listen, are the ones who are at the local level, are the ones who say, you know, we're going to use these people, but we're not going to overuse them. So have the volunteers that say maximum 2 hours a week. You know, I mean, the people who are useful are really pragmatic. And good churches.
I think I disagree.
We never agree.
Maybe I'll say this in the reverse order, because I've said many negative things and used words like tragic and insoluble. And I'm going to say it again, but I'll start then by saying pointing those things out is not to say there are no things we can do. So pointing to the brick wall in front of our moving vehicle is not to say there's no solution. It's to say try another route or do something different. And the wall may be very large, to be clear. Let me start my disagreement by noting the question was about, you framed in terms of like a universal brotherhood, and the responses, which I agree with as far as they go, are all about local solutions, which is not the same thing, right? They're not necessarily based on any belief in universal humanity. People throughout history have helped those nearby, helped those like themselves, on principles utterly contradictory to universalism. It's actually tribal. No one will help you better than your tribesman. Or the one like you, or your family. And these are very good sources of our humanity. So there's lots we can do to help people in individual situations. But I think it is one of those brick walls to imagine that there is a solution based upon universal brotherhood. In a sense, it's like the cell phone. All these examples are in fact things happening today in which the problems also persist. We have always help people. There have been churches helping people since there have been churches, and so on. I take from that these are not, in fact, radical, progressive, quantum solutions to the problems. They are the endemic patching responses to endemic problems. So they are not the place to look for a change. Universal brotherhood, your question implies, a radical sort of quantum-like alteration in our relationship. I don't think such a thing exists. So the state solution, I'm not in favor of states, as I said in my talk. I observe them as the condition in which we, with our current level of technology and material culture, are likely to organize ourselves. And those conditions for all the shifts of globalization are not changing in any way that we would expect ourselves to move towards a kind of world government or anything like that. And short of that, I think we should expect that the kinds of solutions are these very things: local, personal, connected to a community, patching but not actually altering the basic structure of the system. I profoundly disagree with what I understand to be the tenor of the question, that there is some possible universal solution. Not that it is impossible, absolutely, but it is super unlikely given the nature of human beings, which is not only to integrate and share common humanity, but to divide and separate and make distinctions. That's who we are, and it's how we are as political animals, as we've been called since the Greeks. And we should plan around that, rather than dream something that we will never actually wake up to.
Just want to contribute a little bit of discussion as well. First of all, a little bit go back to our discussion earlier as well. Legal framework or stipulations has to be there. First of all, and perhaps with the institutional arrangement and then policy alignment, where all those actors, either it can be a state level bureaucracy or bigger international institutions, not necessarily the United Nations. For example, within here we have a Rolex, for example, big organization, International Rescue Committee, the World Vision, a lot of big organizations, those who are very important in this process. And then more local organizations And even in the local, we still have kind of smaller religious-based, faith-based, or community-based organizations. So it is a spectrum of those stakeholders, those who will be working through their own respective, let's say, efficiency and the framework that they can. But a little bit, if we go back, United States Refugee Resettlement Program, by the way, is almost 40 years old. They have no reform. And for instance, it's very reactive in nature. And I think something has to be done is reform this to be more proactive and also encourage creativity to deliver more services effectively and efficiently. In fact, we have seen a little bit of that direction, but the fact is structural reform has not happened. So in that thinking, I think we all are the same. We come back to the notion of universal brotherhood, or we live in a global village, that one action locally can affect globally. And what's happening in Burma or Southeast Asia can happen. So with that thinking, I think ultimately it's a movement where we do come up either local level or more broader or higher level of doing policy.
I just want to offer one other thing. I'm kind of tired of states too, but what I saw in Germany that gave me some kind of hope was the difference among cities. And people had a loyalty to cities, and I saw such variation in cities. And I'm hoping that people will have more loyalty and there'll be more variation in city policy. And the city that I found the most interesting in all Germany was Hamburg. And it helps that Hamburg has money. Always you want money to experiment.
The true universal brotherhood.
I told you I'm a pragmatist. I'm too old to be an idealist. That's past. But also, Hamburg is its own state. So it has less bureaucracy. I left Bavaria. Bavaria is awful. Bavaria is full of regulations and it's full of people who are afraid to break rules. So Bavaria finished me off. I mean, I broke more rules in Bavaria than any state in Germany. So I finally left Munich for Cologne. I like Cologne a lot. But Hamburg is really exciting because they're their own state and they have money. And you can do more experimental programs and they have lots of refugees. So again, I think it's important to look in cities. It's important to look in cities where you have mayors, you have leaders that are willing to try things. And I'm really looking to the world now for interesting cities. And there's a fascinating program through the German Marshall Fund where they were looking at cities from Turkey, from Morocco, and Germany. And they were looking at questions of integration. Because these are countries that send and receive migrants. And to me that's fascinating. Those three countries that both send and receive migrants, so all three countries are interested in integration, as they call it, whatever, integration. And to have the mayors, and not just the mayors, but federal officers of cities in these countries learn from each other. And to me, that's a really productive area of research. Do you see that? You're bypassing some of the federal politicians, but you're looking at people who are actually dealing with refugees. You're dealing with municipal policies. You're dealing with private industry at a level where people can make change. And I think that's an area of really exciting research and hopefully positive things to happen.
All right, well, I'd like to thank our panelists as well as our esteemed audience. Once again, thank you, Emily and Marlene, is that right? and the entire administrative staff here at Indiana. You've done a wonderful job, and let's show our appreciation.